David French, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. I always enjoy it so much.
Well, I'm glad you keep coming back for it. So everyone's aware, we normally record these toward the end of the month and then release it on the final Friday of the month. But
Mhm.
it's November. We have Thanksgiving coming up, holiday schedules. So we are actually recording this on November 11th, but we're going to release it, I think, the Friday after Thanksgiving on Black Friday. But because of that, we didn't have enough. Well, there's always news, but I didn't feel like there was a ton of new content since the last time we spoke. So we've decided that this is going to be a special French Friday. It's going to be November Nerdfest, and
Love
it'll
it.
be released right after Thanksgiving. So everyone can go into the holidays with this wonderful, exciting Nerdfest episode.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I'm always ready for this conversation, and I never get to fully have it. Like in our dispatch podcast, like Sarah in Advisory Opinion, she's always just shoving me past the nerd. There's a specific nerdery we have, which is legal nerdery.
Mm-hmm.
But then as soon as I start to bring up Dune, like I'm bullied out of talking about it. It's terrible. It's
Well,
terrible.
this will be your release.
All right.
Guess what day it is? Oh, it's French Friday, it's French Friday, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
I have a series of different nerdy topics that all relate to movies mostly.
Okay.
That I want to tackle, and I don't know how many we'll get to, but we're going to start with Dune because that is
Okay.
the most recent release. I heard you talk to Jonah and some of the other nerds orbiting around the dispatch about Dune. To begin with, one of the great strengths of both the book and the film is just the world building that
Yes.
occurs, right? It's a fantastically detailed world building exercise that Frank Herbert has done with Dune. So here's my question. As you came away from the movie, do you think the movie was successful enough at the world building that Frank Herbert accomplished in the book? Did it do enough, especially for those who hadn't read the book, to initiate them into the reality of this Dune world?
Well, I can only refer to the focus group of one, which was my wife, who
Okay.
rarely goes to these movies with me, but a bunch of couples or friends were going, and so she watched it, found it, visually compelling and
Mhm.
story interesting, but a lot of it mystified her. And so one fair criticism, and I even hesitate to use the word criticism for such a majestic cinematic achievement, but one fair criticism is that if you didn't know anything about that world, there is a lot of it that would be confusing. And just to take one quick moment, and we're already diving in deep here. The way they fought with shields and knives.
Yes.
And so why were they, it's obvious they had lasers, which they call like laser guns or laser guns in the book, but they weren't using them. Instead, they're doing this weird hand-to-hand combat. And in the book, it explains that if a laser beam impacts with these personal shields, it creates a nuclear-sized detonation. So you just don't fight like that. So it's sort of like you go back to this hand-to-hand combat. But then there was this weird thing about the fast blade is diverted by the shield, and the slow blade is what works. Well, that's a little bit explained, kind of a little.
Yeah.
But then it's totally the significance. What's then lost to that is the significance of the hand-to-hand combat that Paul Atreides had with the Fremen warrior. It was the first time he fought non-shielded. He should have died. It's a totally different way of fighting, and yet he was able to master it against an experienced Fremen warrior. We're already so deep into this, but that's a very long way of saying if there was a failing, that was the failing. But then David Lynch's Dune from '84 tried to do that with all of these voiceovers, and that didn't work either.
Right.
So I'm just
Too
not
cumbersome.
sure how you do it. Good.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I had. I wondered, for someone who hadn't read the book, could they follow along what was happening? And this is where Lord of the Rings did such a brilliant job at the beginning of the film, where they had, I think it was a 4-minute prologue where Cate Blanchett does the voiceover as Galadriel, explaining the history of the ring, giving you some sense of both geography and the different races of Middle Earth and some of the background story, and it set it up really well. And there's a similar prologue in Dune in the film where Chaney does about it's shorter, maybe 2.5, 3 minute prologue, and explains some of what's going on in Dune, but it doesn't really get into many aspects of it. So, you brought up, why do they fight with swords? Why are there no computers?
Yeah.
And what are the mentats and how do they
Yeah.
function? And nothing about really the political structure of the
Yeah.
drop of all the intrigue that's going on in the story. So I agree. Stunningly beautiful film. The music was amazing.
Oh, incredible.
If you'd read the book, you were probably entranced by the whole thing, as I was. But I wonder if it was just a little bit too opaque for a newcomer.
I think empirically it was. Empirically it was. It's a movie that was made for people who read the book. And it's interesting. I read something from Sonny Bunch who said the sequel may have been greenlit kind of only because of the pandemic, because it was successful by pandemic era box office standards, but not successful by how they would normally calculate a box office success. And so the pandemic era relative success, which is driven by these huge numbers of people who read the book and have been waiting for something like this for years,
right,
gave it sort of an artificial relative boost. So I think there might be something to that, because there was so much to this. Like, the whole aspect of the fact that there's no computers is one of the geniuses of the whole science of the whole Dune project itself, because this is something that came from the 1960s. And when you read sort of 1960s era sci-fi, a lot of it feels dated because they couldn't really imagine tech in the future.
Yeah.
And so he just skipped through that whole thing by saying, well, what we did is we got rid of AI, we got rid of artificial intelligence, and then had to develop human beings in these very specific, highly specialized ways to do the same things that were only done with computers before.
Okay, here's another question I have about the film. There's been a lot of stories, books that have been made into films, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and there's always criticism from fans about how faithful was it to the book and what did they change and why did they change that. And I actually wondered, after seeing the film, was Villeneuve actually too faithful to the book?
Mm-hmm.
And the part that I focus on is the character of Paul himself, Paul Atreides, who is the protagonist. In the film, portrayed by Timothée Chalamet, he's very stoic,
Yeah.
and very cerebral and not very emotive. And that's very faithful to how he is in the book, because he is this sort of messianic figure that has this incredibly complicated inner life that you're given access to through the pages of the book, much harder to do on screen. But I wondered, is he not relatable? Is he not emotionally engaging as a screen personality? And was that too faithful to the book in the way that, is Star Wars, for example, and Luke Skywalker heavily based on and influenced by Dune? Was that a better character for the screen because an audience can relate to an emotive, whiny Luke Skywalker and not so much a stoic, messianic Paul Atreides, because he just doesn't display that much emotion on the screen?
By the way, speaking of the whiny Luke Skywalker, I remember, I sort of saw Star Wars in two distinct phases in life. I'm old enough to remember seeing it in the theaters when it first came out. And Luke was a hero, like a capital H hero. Fast forward to when George Lucas re-released it in the 1990s. Remember the remastered? Oh, yeah. I remember the first time he comes on screen and I'm thinking, he's a whiny, like annoying guy, I don't know. Here's why I really liked the Timothée Chalamet portrayal, is because Paul Atreides is a completely different heroic character,
right,
than Luke Skywalker. He is completely different. He is the reluctant, in the arc, spoilers, in the arc of everything, he's the reluctant Messiah. He is the person who hates and sort of fears the destiny that he sees for himself. And the destiny that he sees for himself is not some sort of leader of a glorious utopia, but the leader of a holy war
Right.
that's going to sweep through the galaxy. And it's a destiny that he is drawn towards and repulsed by at the same time. So I think if you're talking about, he's just a different character. And
Right.
so how do you
Well,
portray that? And I thought Chalamet did a really nice job of it.
and to your point, like that's very clear in the book. I didn't get that really clearly in the film. He
Yeah.
has that moment with his mother in the tent where he has that vision that's brought on by the exposure to the spice, and he kind of rages a little bit in the tent. You did this to me. You made me this.
Yeah.
And to, again, a reader of the book understands what's happening in that moment. I didn't pick up that a non-reader of the book would
No.
have understood that
Correct.
that conflict within him. So again, final question on Dune, or observation before we move on to the next topic. One of the things I've realized in recent films is that there's so much content now on YouTube. There's so many fans out there who are making explanatory videos. Like, here's the politics of Dune and here's
Yes.
the history of Dune. That anything that a viewer doesn't understand, you can go to YouTube and kind of get the cliff notes of.
Sure.
And I wonder if too many filmmakers are actually maybe deliberately or intuitively understand that that's now the world we live in, so they don't have to include all of that context in their films because it exists for those who want it. And I'm not sure if that's good or bad.
Yeah, that's a really good. I would say it's, if you're going to make a film with that as the understanding of what some people will do, that's going to be a mistake. Because if it's going to be a giant blockbuster, like it's something, if you're going to spend $300 million making a movie, which is roughly in the arena of what they spent, you're going to have to bring in a giant pile of people who are never going to look up one darn thing on YouTube.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
there's sort of a way that there's kind of a challenge that these guys have that's really tough. And it gets even tougher when you're dealing with a book as dense as Dune. The one group you absolutely have to have is you have to have the fanboys.
Right.
If you don't have the fanboys, if you don't have the zealots, then you don't get that sort of market multiplier effect of all of these nerds like you and me geeking out about it in public. And if you lose those people, then you're left with the casuals, and who are the casuals that are going to tune into Dune? So you got to have the zealots who will evangelize the casuals. So I think he knew that, and he made a movie for the zealots. And the only reason my wife came to that movie is she's married to a zealot. So it worked in our family.
Okay, perfect transition to Star Wars.
Yes.
First question, what's worse, the sequels or the prequels?
2 of the 3 prequels are nightmares.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you thought Revenge of the Sith was okay.
Let me put it this way. My view in my mind, here's how I preserve my love for Star Wars. I preserve my love for Star Wars by believing we have essentially a 6-movie arc. And it starts with Revenge of the Sith. Then it goes to Solo and to Rogue One, then to New Hope, then to Empire Strikes Back, and then to Return of the Jedi.
Uh-huh.
If you want to have Force Awakens, because Force Awakens is just a fun movie, you can have it in there. But if you look at those 6 movies, that's a great 6-movie arc. To me, 2 of the last, the last 2 of the sequels, they just no. And then the first 2 of the prequels, Phantom Menace is an atrocity.
Yes.
But Rogue One is a spectacular movie. Rogue One is glorious, and Solo is underrated. So I think some of the new stuff is good, and Force Awakens was actually good. But the last 2, man.
Yeah, really horrible. Okay, so when my children were little, I introduced them to Star Wars, but I only introduced them to the original trilogy. And I didn't even let them know that prequels existed because I didn't want them to grow up in a universe where those films were a reality.
Yeah.
And it's we tell our children certain lies, or at least we don't tell them the whole truth in order to make their childhood a little bit more enchanted, right? Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, that kind of stuff. And similarly, I didn't want their childhood to be devastated by the prequels. But then when the sequels were announced, when Lucas sold to Disney and the sequels were announced and J.J. Abrams was brought on board and Lawrence Kasdan was brought in to help, I was like, oh my goodness, this is it. This is what we've been waiting for since I was a young kid. Some really good new Star Wars movies. Force Awakens comes out and you go, it was a bit derivative, but
it was fun.
It was fun.
Yeah.
And then The Last Jedi came out, and it exactly going back to your point with Dune, like they lost the fanboys.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
In a big way. As you look back on and maybe do a post-mortem on the Disney sequel trilogy, what do you think went wrong there?
There's a moment. There is a moment in time, Skye. And I'm going to tell you this moment in time. And once you realize this moment in time, your disappointment with what might have been will become profound. Okay.
I'm so looking forward to being even more disappointed.
So in The Last Jedi, there was, let's just put aside the weirdness that Princess Leia discovers her force powers in the vacuum of space. We'll give them a mulligan on that whole thing. Okay. But there's a moment. Okay. So Rey is in the First Order Star Destroyer. Okay. The hyperspace suicide attack has occurred, which violates all kinds of Star Wars laws of combat, but it was so cool on the screen that it was cool. I mean, when I saw it on the screen, I gasped. Like that was a cool moment. All right. And so then you have, Rey is sitting there and you've got, why did I say Kylo? Okay. Rey is sitting there and Kylo Ren has just saved her. It has just saved her. The Rebel fleet is retreating. The Star Destroyer is disintegrating. And Kylo extends his hand to Rey. Now, in the movie, Kylo Ren then does a kind of a Dr. Evil monologue at this point, like, join me, rule the galaxy.
Yeah.
Well, you know enough about Rey that she's not going to go for that. But you also know she has affection for Kylo Ren. What if Kylo extends his hand, doesn't do the Dr. Evil monologue? She grabs his hand, and they together look at the retreating Rebel fleet, fade to black, end of movie. Okay? Then, is Kylo with Rey? Is Rey with Kylo? Nobody knows. We can't wait to the next movie. And it would be consistent with that Empire Strikes Back kind of ethos, which was they just ended the movie with the bad guys seeming to lose. I mean, the good guys seeming to lose. And then the anticipation for the next movie builds. It could have been incredible. Instead, it was all Dr. Evil. And then you have this absurd encounter with a holographic Luke. And somehow that kills him. And what the heck? And I remember looking at that moment and thinking, Rey's going to grab his hand. This is going to be cinematic perfection. I'm going to spend the next 2 years in nervous anticipation. And then no. Now tell me, Skye, would that not have been an incredible ending?
It certainly would have been a huge improvement. I will definitely give you that. But I think it speaks to the fact that there was no plan here.
Right.
They did not sketch out a 3-movie arc and then bring in different directors and writers to fill in the details. They were flying by the seat of their pants, and it felt like Rian Johnson came in and did The Last Jedi and took every unresolved element from J.J. Abrams' first movie, The Force Awakens, and basically inverted expectations, right? So Rey is handing the lightsaber to Luke at the end of the first movie, and he takes it and throws it over his shoulder, right? It's just like one thing after another. He just, I don't know if they have a personal feud with each other. Like, does Rian Johnson hate J.J. Abrams and just wanted to poop all over his setups? And then J.J. gets the series back for the final movie, and they had to do essentially a whole trilogy in one film in order to make something that made sense. And it was, before what was the last one? The Rise of Skywalker was released.
Skywalker, yeah.
I did a long Twitter thread giving my best shot at trying to tie together this whole trilogy in a third movie. Like, what should the narrative be? And I think
Mhm.
I did a better job than J.J. Abrams did in The Rise of Skywalker. So I don't think it was completely salvageable, but I did the best I could in order to incorporate what Rian Johnson had done in The Last Jedi. But super disappointing. And I don't know how Disney takes a $4 billion property and not carefully craft that trilogy. It's just, what do you
Yeah.
make of the criticisms that, and this kind of applies a little, we'll get into the DC universe, the Marvel universe in a little bit, but that Star Wars suffered from being too woke.
I don't pay any attention to that at all. Like,
Okay.
to me, the flaws with Star Wars were much more like on Rise of Skywalker, they actually had a cavalry charge on a Star Destroyer. And I'm watching that, I'm going, really? Can you imagine being on the bridge? Sir, the cavalry is charging on the Star Destroyer's deck. Really? Tilt the ship.
Right.
You know,
Or how
I mean,
about bombs dropping in space and in The Last Jedi? What that is ridiculous.
yeah, we have advanced hyperspace technology. Therefore, we shall create the dynamics of a B-17 raid over Berlin. What?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I was much more troubled by that. Look, my view on this, all of this stuff about sci-fi, one of the fun things about sci-fi is you can do different stuff with it. You can do crazy different things with. I don't sit there. I'm not. The last thing I'm interested in when I'm watching a whether it's a Marvel movie or a DC movie or a Star Wars movie is, well, and did they have if they had 5 women together fighting, was that an evidence of wokeness or was that natural to the I don't care.
Right.
I don't care. You know, so I really, I when I walk into a movie like that, I am not sort of doing the deep political analysis. And another reason why I'm not doing that deep political analysis is all of that is like a veneer. We could dive into this, but almost all of your superhero movies and almost all of your sci-fi movies are very much small c conservative in the sense of the kind of the deep values that they're surfacing, the sort of the deep values of courage, the deep values of self-sacrifice, the deep values of, a lot of them are, a kind of smaller versions of the big story, sort of the gospel story.
Sure.
So the whole genre is like, very small c conservative in sort of its understanding of the profound values that shape a culture and shape a community, and the values that we should admire and the vices that we should reject. And so, it's I remember writing something about like the zombie genre years ago about how was The Walking Dead getting woke. I was like, you can paint a battleship with in rainbow colors. It's still a battleship, And so it's that's, the whole genre itself is profoundly small c conservative in a million different ways.
Yeah, I think that is part of the attraction for me to a lot of these stories is they're archetypal.
Yeah.
Right? They're like the ancient myths and the fairy tales. They are good and evil, and they have something to say about the human condition without putting it in the current context where things seem so complicated to us. And
Right.
that's the beauty of these stories, apart from the fact that they're easy to access in most cases, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, last thing on Star Wars. Why do you think The Mandalorian works so well, where some of the cinematic releases have struggled and failed?
That's a really good question because it is. So the Star Wars at its best was not really sci-fi; it was science fantasy.
Right.
It wasn't, and there's a difference.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it was also it really did this very unique thing with the best of Marvel can do. For example, DC doesn't even really try for this as much, but the best of Marvel, that it makes something fun for kids and wondrous for adults, or intriguing enough or interesting enough for adults. So there's 2 layers working at the same time.
Yeah.
And Mandalorian nails that. So, I watch it with my youngest daughter, and, she is so captivated by the relationship between the Mandalorian and Baby Yoda, and that is what she hones in on. That she loves that, and of course she likes the adventure too and everything. Well, I think the world building around the Mandalorian culture and everything is very cool, and I think it's cool how it's the original Star Wars was also kind of a Western,
Right.
and this Mandalorian very much has that Western ethos. And then they throw in cool events like when you have Luke Skywalker come to save the day, and you begin to see how powerful he was at the peak of his powers. So it's this combination of fun for kids, rich enough for adults to sort of dive into in that unhealthy nerd way that adults dive into things like this. And then just kind of wondrous moments that everybody can like. And that's what made Star Wars so magical. And one of the things that made Phantom Menace so painful is it's like Lucas knew the formula, but couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah.
So you end up with an atrocity like Jar Jar Binks, instead of Yoda, so right.
Yeah, and I think what works so well with Mandalorian, and you're alluding to this, is, and this is true of all these stories when they work really well. It's fundamentally the story about the Mandalorian and Baby Yoda. That's the heart and centerpiece of everything, and then everything else goes around that. When you go back to the original Star Wars trilogy, it was all about Luke, Leia, and Han. That is the core of the story. That chemistry was everything, and then they built this amazing, wonderful world around it. And when I look at the prequels and the sequels, they both failed to establish a heart, a relationship at the core that you cared about. And if you don't have that relationship at the core, then nothing else resonates as much. It's what Peter Jackson did so well with the original Lord of the Rings trilogy and the films, is he understood the relational core, especially between Sam and Frodo, but then some of the other characters, and you cared about that, and then all the magical things around it made sense. And that just didn't exist, for example, in the Hobbit movies that he did. He never established that relational core that you care about. For me, that's the magic of The Mandalorian. And I hope that as they continue to expand the Star Wars universe in Disney Plus shows and things, that they maintain that relational heartbeat and take us on wonderful new adventures. But that's where I think they absolutely dropped the ball in some of the movies.
Well, and the other thing is to sort of go back to that, again, what we keep calling sort of these really deep sort of heart level civilizational kind of stories. What is The Mandalorian? It's an ethic of care. It's the formation of a bond,
right?
A bond very much like a parent-child bond. Even though I think in the mythology that Baby Yoda is far older than the Mandalorian, but still there's this. So you're watching this sort of extremely relational, deeply powerful bond form that connects with your own bonds, your own sense of those bonds in your life. And so that something really deep inside you is yearning for that relationship to form.
Right.
And they did just a masterful job of having that relationship unfold slowly, rather than at the end of episode 1, the Mandalorian's like, oh, here's my new kid, Baby Yoda,
Right.
And I thought that was just masterfully done.
Okay, let's transition to Marvel and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In your opinion, what was the best MCU movie?
Oh, I mean, those are good questions. I think this is the easy answer. This is the easy answer, but it's to say in one sense because it's the most popular. But Avengers Endgame was really truly a cinematic achievement.
Yeah.
But if you remove that one, if you remove Avengers Endgame, I thought Captain America: Civil Wars was really good. DC level good. And I think that the Guardians of the Galaxy one was outstanding, but in a different, it almost didn't feel fully Marvel-y to me. And so, but Guardians of the Galaxy and Captain America: Civil Wars, to me, are the highlights.
Well, can you pick that up?
It just felt like it felt kind of outside the universe.
Yeah.
If that made sense. And then Thor Ragnarok was something just sort of where I felt like Marvel was like, okay, we know this whole thing is sort of crazy absurd that we're talking about, and we're just diving into the crazy absurdity in a funny way, and it was just fun. Like, it was
Yeah.
just fun. Endgame
I
felt like there were stakes, though, and same with Civil Wars.
I concur with that completely. Going back to Guardians of the Galaxy, the first one, that was a turning point for me
Okay.
because as the MCU was developing and unfolding, and the Iron Man movies came out, like, wow, those were fantastic. And then they announced that they were going to do Thor. I was like, oh
Mm-hmm.
my gosh, this is so stupid. You cannot make that character into anything worth watching on the screen. And I thought, it wasn't great, but I thought, okay, they pull it off. And then they announced they were going to do Captain America. I'm like, oh no, that's way too cheesy. So,
Mm-hmm.
and they brilliantly pulled it off. And so after a while, they started building this reputation of, we're going to take these old characters and we're going to make them relevant in a cinematic way, and then I found out they're doing Guardians of the Galaxy, and I didn't know those characters. I wasn't that
Mm-hmm.
big of a comic book geek to really engage. And I find out that there's a raccoon in a tree and it's
Yeah.
set in space. I was like, this is it. This is when they've jumped the shark. This is when they've gone too far, and they're blowing all the credibility they've established with the MCU thus far. And I went and saw that movie, and it was freaking brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh my gosh, they can do
Yeah.
anything. If
Yeah.
they can pull off that, they can do anything. I wouldn't say it's the best Marvel movie, but it was the one. I think it's one of them. It's underrated in how significant that movie was in showing how capable a studio they were.
Yes.
And then it culminated, you're absolutely right, with Endgame, Infinity War and Endgame. What do you make of the MCU going forward? Like, no doubt that you're going to look at the Infinity Stone saga thing, from first Iron Man all
Mm-hmm.
the way through Endgame as an unparalleled achievement.
Mm-hmm.
My question was, okay, after that, are they going to be able to keep it up? And what do you think of their post Endgame efforts thus far?
So I think they're still in the Endgame hangover.
Mm-hmm.
So, what they've come out with since Endgame is sort of like standard issue Marvel, which is a movie that you walk into the theater and you enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
You enjoy it. Like, in my view, standard issue Marvel is kind of like cotton candy. While you're tasting it, it's sweet and it's good, and then it dissolves instantly. To where sometimes, if you ask me 1 week after a Marvel movie I've seen, who was the villain in the movie you just saw? Oh, shoot, who was that villain?
Yeah.
So I think they've kind of gone back to that, which I understand. It's a formula that works really well for them. But at the same time, after the Infinity War saga, and then it was the culmination of this really interesting on-screen chemistry with Captain America and Iron Man.
Yeah.
That every movie where those two are together is just a cut above.
Yes.
Everyone is just a cut above. And so when you take them out of the universe, that's a giant hole to fill. And, look, when the Marvel universe was first unfolding, we didn't know what it was going to build to. We didn't see it coming. So they have earned a lot of trust with me. But I am not as interested in each new release as I was. But that's because of the last 3 to 4 years, I knew each new release was building to something.
Right. To bring the woke thing back again, I know you don't go into these movies looking for political messages or stuff, but there's been a lot of buzz, and actually just this week there was a story that came out that Bob Chapek, who's the CEO of Disney, is in some
Mhm.
kind of conflict with Kevin Feige about the future of Marvel, that Marvel's getting too woke. And there seems to be a trend where established characters are leaving or being killed off and replaced by younger people of color or women characters. So, there's She-Hulk is coming out, and the
Right.
new Miss Marvel's a Muslim lesbian or something.
Right.
There's rumor that the new Iron Man is going to be Ironheart, which is a girl. Obviously, the tragic loss of Chadwick Boseman and Black Panther means that
Mhm.
they have to replace that character. It's, I think, a woman who's going to be stepping into that role. Do you think there's anything to that? And is it evidence of a studio capitulating to a cultural dynamic perhaps too far, or is this it's a nothing sandwich and we should not make a big deal about it?
To me, I care about how good is the product on the screen.
Yeah.
Okay. And so here's a paradigmatic example of where I think a studio was trying to do something, and maybe it did let its dedication to, we're going to reimagine this in a more woke way, get ahead of the product on the screen. And so that was the reimagined Ghostbusters.
Yes.
Which it was a weird dynamic. It felt like if you're gonna publicly criticize Ghostbusters, you're anti-woman, right? That there's something wrong with you if you're publicly criticizing, because look at this noble effort to reimagine Ghostbusters. But the movie still has to be good.
Right.
And that's one of the things. This is one of the reasons why I don't get too into the whole woke how many. I don't roll my eyes when I see 5 or 6 female superheroes charging Thanos in that famous scene in Endgame.
Yeah.
It felt seamless to the whole thing. I don't care, but I do think that there is a sort of a market-based discipline that starts to lock in, where if it's obvious that you're just doing something because you think it's a politically appropriate or right thing to do, it's going to manifest itself in the product, and it will fall to the side. Now, Shang-Chi, there's a lot of conversation around Shang-Chi, and okay, here we're rolling out an Asian superstar, action star. The movie was just really fun. It was really good.
Yeah.
It was really good. And I have the same rule I apply to movies. I apply to NBA stars, to college football, to pro football. I'm just not looking for entertainment that is it's not like I'm going to admire LeBron James 1 minute because he started a charter-like school in Akron, Ohio for underprivileged kids. And then I'm going to hate LeBron James the next minute because he said things about China that I legitimately, definitely disagree with,
Right.
And so it's just, I feel like that's a hard way. I just don't feel like that's the right way to live life. I mean, I think of my own self. I think I would hate, and people do treat me and they treat you like this too, Skye. We're only as good as our last tweet.
Right.
Like the entire regard a human being has for us, some undefined number of human beings, is like literally reduced to the last thing we wrote, the last tweet we said, or the last podcast we broadcast. And so I just don't want to impose that burden on other people. And I'm really interested in seeing good movies. And so I've long ago, I used to write some about it because there was a lot of this around the Game of Thrones commentary. What it was, the Khaleesi, the white savior complex was and all of that stuff. And I used to kind of get into that. And now I just pull back from it, and I'm more looking at it. Does that movie work? Is that a good movie?
Yeah. I was watching something recently. There's the story of Late Night. It was a CNN documentary series I've been watching, and there was this interview with Whoopi Goldberg, and she was talking about Johnny Carson back in the late 1960s, all the social upheaval and some of the exclusion of people of color and women from comedy and stuff like that. And Whoopi Goldberg had a line, something along the lines of, at the end of the day, he was funny. Johnny Carson was funny. And at the end of the day, funny is what matters to a comedian, regardless of your gender or your race or your politics or whatever. You have to be funny.
Yeah.
And likewise, I don't really care about whether a studio is intentionally bringing diverse representation into their films, as long as it's a good film.
Yeah.
And I do feel, we talked about this in one of our podcasts with the Ghostbusters thing. I wonder how some women feel about being handed these used up franchises rather than creating new properties and new characters for women to inhabit and own. Yeah. Like and there's some of this with Star Wars and some other properties. It's like Ocean's 8 or 11 or 12, whatever that was, that they recast with all women. Is it insulting to take established characters and say, well, now we're going to have a woman play that role just because we want to have a woman play that role? And wouldn't it be better to bring more women or diverse representation into these films with new characters that are their own thing, rather than, well, now it's going to be a younger Iron Man who's a woman, or now it's going to be, Hawkeye is going to be a teenage girl instead of a middle-aged white guy. And so that's the kind of stuff I'm going, I don't know if that's really progressive as people think.
Well, I think you raise a good point, but it's also the case that everything's remade now.
That's true.
I mean, they're talking about a remake of Roadhouse. You remember that Patrick Swayze movie?
Yes.
So everything is remade now. But the other thing I would say is if your standard is, and this is, I think, something that's really important for people to realize, if your standard is, I like high quality things that are produced by talented directors and actors, and that's your real standard, that's radically more inclusive.
Yes.
Because a studio system or whatever that's locked into a good old boy network is going to be limiting your talent pool. It's going to be limiting who is going to be able to, what kind of stories are going to be told and who's going to be able to tell those stories. And so, I feel like if you're just saying, look, I love watching good stories. I love seeing good stories. That's a radically more inclusive kind of point of view than whatever, then I like good stories that match my politics, or there's a good old boy network, or there's this formula or that formula.
Well, there's also this blowback that when a movie doesn't do well, some people go, well, it's because it was too progressive and people aren't on board with it, and there's a conservative backlash to it. And I'm going, no, it was just a bad movie. It
like
was
the
just
Ghostbusters remake. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Many, many years ago, I was at a wedding. I was officiating a wedding and part of a wedding. And I was at the reception, and the families had no alcohol at this reception. It was a very kind of conservative Christian thing. And there was one guy at my table who had smuggled a bunch of alcohol into the reception and was getting completely hammered and making an idiot of himself and disrupting the reception. So I kind of pulled him aside and dragged him out to the parking lot because and he went off on me, just super angry at me, and said, you hate me because I'm gay and you're a pastor. And I said, no, I don't hate you because you're gay. I can't stand you because you're an a-hole. Like you are just you're just being a jerk, because it has nothing to do with your sexuality. So similarly, like people want to grasp at these political explanations for why a movie doesn't do well when sometimes it's just not a very good movie. Okay.
And the other reality on that, real fast, is we totally overestimate the extent to which the large scale movie going population is even aware of these disputes.
Yeah.
Because a lot of this stuff is Twitter. We all know from the numbers that the power users of Twitter are somewhere around 1 to 1.5% of America. So the people who go to if a movie is going to be very, very popular, you're going to get millions of people into the theater, far more than the number, and how many of them are influenced by Twitter power users?
Exactly.
5%, 4%. I mean, so people are constantly overreading the importance of these fights, when what actually wins or loses the day is real people going to a theater and saying, I like that, or I don't like that. And I'm not going to say that those real people aren't influenced by biases and prejudices in the way that we all are, but we've had enough examples of very good movies where the actors are from every race, creed, color, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, that have all succeeded. I think that we can now start to say, can we just talk about how good the movie is?
Okay, last area, and I'm going to give you the choice because I have two categories that we could go from. We can either talk about DC and their movie messes. I think you're probably a bigger fan of them than I am.
Much bigger.
Or James Bond, 007.
Oh, DC.
Okay.
DC.
I've
never gotten into the Bond. I've never gotten into the Bond series.
Yeah, I've seen some stuff you've said and written where you've been more supportive of the DC movies, the more recent one. I mean, the Dark Knight series with Christopher Nolan, absolutely brilliant. I mean, who can fault that at all?
Yeah.
But the more recent stuff by Zack Snyder, The Man of Steel, Batman versus Superman, Justice League stuff.
Yes.
I've just never liked any of them.
Oh, Skye.
And okay, I have many questions here that we could spend a whole nother episode on. It felt to me like they were rushing to catch up to the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and they didn't take the time to really develop the characters and the world building the way that Marvel did. And they just rushed all these characters into a team up movie, and it just didn't click. It didn't work very well. So tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, so here's the issue you have with the DC universe. There's two DC Snyder trilogies. There's the theatrically released Snyder trilogy, and then there's the director's cut Snyder
and I have
trilogy.
seen both.
Okay. So my submission is that the studio cuts to the Snyder movies were unforgivably bad.
Yeah.
And so that Batman versus Superman Ultimate Edition is just a superior movie in every way to the theatrical version of Batman v Superman. And then the Snyder cut is just magnificent. It's just magnificent. So,
Wow.
yeah. So here's my basic take on now, and in a lot of this is what is it that you take to the theater? What kind of stuff do you like? I mean, and I tend to like darker themed movies and darker themed TV shows. And the thing that always kind of bothered me about Marvel is that Marvel, I never felt like until sort of the blip, the Thanos snap, never took its premise seriously enough to explore what it'd be like to a world if these people actually appeared.
Yeah.
And so they treated them something like, oh, it's really serious, but they're also kind of like superpowered Kardashians at the same time. And so it never really dealt with that. Whereas the Zack Snyder universe is, and Sonny Bunch, this is Sonny Bunch's concept, and I've really stuck in my mind ever since. Zack Snyder's presumption, or his thing, is, what if the gods, small g, were real? How would that impact the world? What would their powers be like compared to the real world? And when you look at the Snyder trilogy, what you're looking at really is the shock and awe and burden and of all of this together. And I think it's just really well done, because I think the whole thing, the whole experience, if you're just going to put yourself in the imagination of a Superman comes from, somewhere, followed by this, Man of Steel, I think, is an incredibly underrated movie, followed by this invading alien force. What you would see and how that would be is a heck of a lot more like what you saw in Man of Steel than anything you've seen in Marvel.
Yeah.
And I loved that thought experiment. And I thought I loved sort of the creativity of that thought experiment. And then the fear. So why would Batman turn against Superman? Why on earth would he do that? Well, he had just seen what had happened to Gotham. To Metropolis, when you had the attack of Zod, and he doesn't know, he's not familiar with the politics of Krypton. He knows there's this super being who can wreck everything. And so what do you do about it? So there's a lot of this that I think was very sort of true to human nature in a way that Marvel isn't quite. And that allowed me to dive into the story more.
I mean, I don't disagree with what you're saying there. And to be transparent, as a kid, I was much more a fan of the DC characters.
Mm-hmm.
So, I grew up on the Christopher Reeve Superman movies. I love, especially the first two,
Right.
The Richard Donner stuff. I loved that Superman mythology. Loved Batman. Christopher Nolan's Batman is by far my favorite. I like those characters. I was not as familiar with Marvel when the DC, the Marvel universe started unrolling. And that's part of my disappointment. I agree with you. I would say Man of Steel was probably the best film of the bunch. It was actually filmed not too far from where I live. And yet I didn't feel like the execution of these stories was not what I had hoped for. There wasn't enough character. There wasn't enough heart in it. As much as it may have been gritty, I know David Goyer was critical in bringing that kind of gritty reality to these films and the screenplays. It didn't land for me. It felt a little bit paint by number. Like it was made for the massive Chinese audience who wants a spectacle, but doesn't care as much about character development and depth of connection, that heart that we talked about with the Mandalorian. I just didn't get that much from these movies, especially the later ones.
Well, that's why you just have to say to yourself, the theatrical releases don't exist. They don't exist.
Yeah.
They don't exist. So we'll sit down, take 10 hours, because it's going to take about 11 hours. Take an 11-hour stretch of time, sit down, watch Man of Steel, Batman versus Superman Ultimate Edition, then Snyder Cut, Justice League, boom, boom, boom. Be pulled into it and immersed. And I feel like it comes across, it earns it. It earns the sort of, by the end of the Justice League, the Snyder Cut, by the end of the Justice League, it feels like this is an earned union. Now, it's a much smaller than Avengers. I mean, it's not, Shield and all of this and all of that. But yeah, and plus, I just never could immerse myself into the Marvel movies in the same way that I could immerse myself into the DC movies. And then, I think DC is actually pursuing a kind of a smart strategy right now, going more for sort of the one-off movie as opposed to trying to build this. So Joker was a one-off movie.
Yeah.
And what I would say about Joker is I'm glad I saw it and I never want to see it again.
That's very much how I felt. Yes. It's too dark, too, yeah.
Even for me, man, even for me.
Yeah. And that's where I felt like early on they saw the success of Marvel and they're like, oh, we need to do that. We need our own cinematic universe. And they rushed it rather than, why not do 2 or 3 Superman movies or 1 or 2 or 3 new Batman movies and Wonder Woman movies and then bring them together in some way. But it was one Superman movie and then we suddenly have a team up, with all 3 of them. It just felt underdeveloped and a little rushed. So, all right, David, thank you for this ability to go nerd on us. And for those of you who've actually persisted and gotten through this whole hour of us talking, a little challenge for those of you who are watching this on YouTube and seeing the video. There are a number of objects in the background of my room, of my video, that are nerdish. And if you can identify them and tag me on Twitter, and whoever can identify the soonest, that person is going to get some brand new Holy Post swag sent to them.
Oh, I see some.
Just in time for the holidays. So there's your challenge, and that's your reward for sticking through here to the end. And we look forward to next month where we will be back with another French Friday that deals with the real world, not just these fantasy worlds. French Friday is a production of The Holy Post, featuring David French and me, Skye Jethani. Production by Carla Haskins. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This podcast is made possible by the support of Holy Post listeners like you. To find out how you can become a supporter of the Holy Post and to engage more common good Christian content, visit holypost.com.